All right, ladies and gentlemen, today's episode is hot. Not because we broke 100 degrees today here in Oklahoma, but because we have a number one New York Times bestselling author on, whose book Deadfall is out today. We're recording this early, but it's out today when you're hearing it, and it's Brad Thor. Brad, how are you?
I'm great, Jeff. Thanks for having me on.
Oh, thank you for carving out time. I know the tour schedule is busy, and getting ready to drop another bestseller. I'm absolutely stunned by Deadfall. I loved it. We're going to get into it here in a
Oh,
minute,
good.
but thank you so much for carving out the time.
You betcha. You betcha.
So let's get right into Deadfall. Deadfall is the grittiest of the Harvath thrillers I think that I've read so
Mhm.
far. You've even said that yourself. Where did the inspiration for this one kind of come from, and where did you see it going?
So it's kind of been building my entire life since I was reading. I grew up reading a lot of World War II thrillers, things like Alistair MacLean, Where
Mhm.
Eagles Dare, which was a great movie with Clint Eastwood and Richard
Yeah.
Burton. I always loved those. And I also love modern World War II stories and films, things like Saving Private Ryan, Band
Hmm.
of Brothers, the series Fury with Brad Pitt.
Oh, that was
And
great.
yeah, it was absolutely fantastic, and, Inglorious Bastards, which was kind of a funny,
Yeah.
take on World War II, funny but not funny.
Yeah.
So I'd always wanted to take my protagonist and drop him into particularly a land war in Europe, but one didn't exist
Hmm.
until Russia invaded Ukraine, and I was reading all about the things that were going on there, and there were a lot of parallels between what the Russians were doing and what the Nazis had done towards the end of World War II, particularly in Poland from August of 44 to October of 44, when Hitler sent in his worst SS brigade to go after the Polish Home Army, particularly in Warsaw. And some of the worst war crimes committed period in outside of the death camps, if you will,
Hmm.
on the battlefield were done during this time by this brigade, and it really echoed what Putin was doing, particularly via the Wagner mercenary group. And so I
Yeah.
thought, you know what, this is it. I am going to have some missing Americans caught behind enemy lines. The U.S. can't put conventional troops in there, so they send Harvath in. And in fact, he's got to sign up for the Ukrainian International Legion just to be a lawful combatant on the ground, a lawful combatant on the ground. And so Harvath goes in with really not a lot of support. Ukraine can't afford to give him anything. He gets a handful of guys out of the International Legion, and they go and try to rescue one American in particular, and then just take a lead pipe to these horrific Russian mercenaries that have been committing war crimes and stealing art as well. There's a little bit of
Yeah.
Monuments Men with Clooney in
Yeah.
this as well. Yeah. So that's
So
kind of the idea.
when the Ukraine war, because you're the king of faction, everybody knows that. I think you've coined the term. When the Ukraine-Russia war went off, what was going through Brad Thor's head on how do I get this into the next book? But
So it's
be Brad
yeah.
Thor
So
and be a little different.
Yeah. So what I was looking at was when the Ukraine war kicked off, there was another historical echo that happened in my head, which was before World War II. Hitler sliced off a piece of Czechoslovakia called the Sudetenland. Hitler said he was only going in to rescue ethnic Germans. And Putin was using the same excuse when he went in 2014 and sliced off eastern Ukraine, the Donbass region. And what's fascinating is Hitler used this excuse. Putin used the same excuse. And when the Czechoslovakian thing happened with Hitler, that's when Neville Chamberlain, before Churchill, was waving around the piece of paper, the Munich Accords, saying Hitler's going to stop here. He's not going to go any further. And the reason we have a G7 now and not a G8 is because we kicked the Russians out of the G8 after
Right.
2014 when they invaded. A lot of people don't realize that when the Soviet Union collapsed, a third of their nuclear arsenal was in Ukraine. And we, the United States, went to the Ukrainians and said, real life, said, we will help you get rid of these nukes. We're going to help you dismantle them. And the Ukrainians said, well, then we can't defend ourselves. And the US said, listen, we promise you, if you agree to get rid of these Soviet nuclear weapons, we will make sure you never lose an inch of your sovereign territory. You're never invaded. Well, that was in the 90s. It was called the Budapest Memorandum. Fast forward to 2014 and Putin is invaded. So it was very similar. And we did nothing. We kicked him out. There were a couple of kicked him out of the G8. There were a couple of sanctions sanctions, a harshly worded letter from the Obama administration, and that was it. And it was so much like what had happened, the naivete that if we just give them what they want, they'll go away and
Yeah,
that'll
yeah.
slake their thirst for conquest. And Putin's a revanchist. And so that's what I was seeing when I looked at all this stuff. I said, I can see where this is going. It's not going to stop in Eastern Ukraine. It's going to keep going, keep going, keep going. But I wanted to create a great white knuckle thrill ride that no matter what ended up happening in Ukraine, the war could end tomorrow. It's
Hmm.
still an evergreen thriller. You could pick this
Oh
book
yeah.
up 10 years from now and have a great, great read. So that's the kind of the delicate balancing act that I had to strike.
And I think you did it as Brad Thor would. Did it flawlessly, where it landed perfectly. I thought, this is a lot of authors in the thriller genre were writing about Ukraine. It's a big topic, and I thought you landed it right in the middle, to where it was about Ukraine and about Russia, but it had its own storyline that it wasn't overwhelmingly about the war. Like, it had a purpose, and I really like how he got. They gave him the captain status and the
Mhm.
Legion, and I thought, oh man, this is so on par with Harvath and what he's trying to do. And the lead pipe, yeah, he went in there with the lead pipe and started swinging. I thought this is the white
Mhm.
knuckle thrill ride that it needed to be, and I thought it was really incredible. I loved it. So thank
Thank
you
you.
guys for sending me a book ahead of time. I was honored. But what is Brad Thor's kind of writing process when it comes to, now you got a book out? Where do you go from now, knowing that you put out a book a
So
year?
yeah, so now it's a cycle. I'm either researching a book, writing a book, editing a book, or publicizing a book. So I'm now in that phase where I'm publicizing. So I'm doing all the media events and all that kind of stuff for the book, which, as people are seeing, this came out today, July 25th. And so now, once I get done with the publicity side of things, then I'll start working on next summer's book. I've been taking notes and doing some gathering of facts and information, and then I have to sit down and say, okay, I've got 4 potential directions I can go with next summer's book. I've got to pick one now. I've got to read those tea leaves and try to beat the headlines, because I think that's what thriller writers do. Their job is
Mhm.
to beat the headlines. So that's the next step for me. When I get off the road doing all the media stuff, then I'll bang, be back, yeah, seat of pants, seat of chair, and be working on next year's book.
So 23 novels in, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, do you feel the pressure to constantly stay ahead of the news? Because you seem to do that impeccably well. Is there a pressure that settles on you ever, where you go, I got to try to stay a
Not
step ahead?
No, not so much a pressure. I actually enjoy that. I actually, that's part of the reason that the government brought me in after 9/11 to help them brainstorm different terrorist scenarios. Where might the bad guy strike next? With what we know, what might be a target at home, abroad, that kind of a thing, when I got involved with the analytic red cell unit after 9/11. So it's just a weird kind of thing that I've got, that I look at stuff and say, okay, I think this is what's coming down the pike. And that's just, so if it's got my attention, kind of like a divining rod, like one of those weird hillbillies that finds out where you should dig your well, it's like, and they've got the
Yeah.
divining rod. That's kind of me, it's just this weird, strange kind of quirky thing that I've got, where I can look at the headlines and say, okay, I think I know what's coming 3 or 4 steps ahead. And if it really resonates with me, that's the beginning. And if the subject is something I want to know more about, then it's exciting, because the idea has to fuel me through, basically a year of research and writing and editing and all this kind of stuff. So I normally like to write about things that excite me and that I want to know more about. So I become better educated so I can distill it down, because I want you to have that great edge of your seat ride. But if you close a Brad Thor novel and you're smarter, you know a little bit more about different things, whether it be at home, abroad, whatever, that to me is the icing on the cake. I mean, my job, it's not a textbook, it's a thriller. You're supposed to have fun, you're supposed to whip through
Yeah.
those pages. But if you're asking some questions, or the faction, right, you don't know where the facts end and the fiction begins. A lot of people say they love to read my books with their laptop open because they can't believe certain things are true, and they'll go
Yeah.
and search them up. So yeah, so that's the thing. No pressure to beat the headlines. It just seems to happen that way. I seem to land on the right story right on time, and it just seems to work out. I mean, I did a book years ago where I'd had 5 5 guys be traded out of Gitmo for one person. And that actually happened. We traded 5 guys in Gitmo, exactly 5 for Bo Bergdahl, the guy that went AWOL in Afghanistan. I could have said 4, I could have said 6. I said 5. I got lucky. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So it's a lot of hard work and a lot of luck, I guess, Jeff.
If you're not following Brad on those social media, you really should, because from time to time he posts something and it says straight out of Black Ice. And it's a headline ripped right out of the news. And then if you read the book and then you go read the headline, you're like, how did he do that? How did he know that? Black Ice was what, 3 books ago?
Yeah.
So
Yeah. 3 books.
I mean, and that's not even the newest one. Like there's older ones that you're still
Yeah.
posting
Still
about that
popping
say,
up.
right out of this book, right out of Near Dark or whatever it may be. And it's amazing how well you could stay ahead of it. When did you really kind of feel like, okay, I got this faction thing and I really like to blur that line between fact and fiction and really make people go, is that true? Is it fiction or not?
You know what? It happened pretty much right at the beginning. I'm a detail guy, so I like the details. But Elmore Leonard was famous for saying to young writers, he gave them 2 pieces of advice. Never start with the weather. It was a dark and stormy night. Don't do that.
That's good.
And number 2, leave out the parts that people skip. So another great piece of advice. And my dad was a huge reader, and I used to. Both my parents were, and I would steal their books. I was probably reading Clancy and Le Carre and Freddie Forsyth a lot younger than I should have been. When they'd finish the book, I'd take it. But my dad always used to joke that he thought Clancy was paid by the word because Clancy's books were so thick.
Yeah.
And Clancy's books were always the hardest ones for me to get through because it'd be pages upon pages of how a guidance system in a missile works. I don't need to know that. I don't care. All I need to know is there's a couple of Green Berets that are sitting in a hide and they're lasing a target, and that the missile sees the laser that the human eye can't see, and that's how the missile knows which building to hit. That's it. I don't need to know about how the fins stabilize or the gyroscope
Yeah.
works. You know what I mean? You may want to say the missile was traveling at this speed because it's sizzling through the air at X amount, 100 miles an hour or whatever. That's kind of the extent of it. So I like details. I think details are the bedrock of a thriller. My wife is funny. She will finish any book she starts. She's amazing. I will put a book down if you put a safety on a Glock. If you can't take enough time and have enough respect for your audience that you figure out how a Glock works, and I don't care if you've never fired one, talk to somebody. Firearms enthusiasts are some of the nicest people. They want everybody to know the nomenclature and how firearms work and how to be a responsible firearms owner. So you put a safety on a Glock, that's it. We're done. I'm putting your book down. I am not finishing it. So I hold myself to that same level. And I think that's one of the reasons why I have such a wide readership. It comes from all walks of life, but I get a lot of people that are in the military, in the intelligence community, in law enforcement, in government, who read my books because I take the time to get the small things right.
That leads me kind of into my next question. General question, but in your opinion, what makes a good thriller?
Oh, that's a good gosh. You'd think I'd get that question every interview, and I don't. That's an
Okay.
excellent question. No, Jeff, I'm serious. It's a really, really good question, and it seems like a natural. And I can't remember anybody ever asking me that. That's an awesome question. I think there's a certain sense of breathlessness, of not knowing what's going to happen next, being kept on the edge of your seat. I like to tell people, citing Dan Brown again, Dan Brown and I have the same agent, and I'm a pantser. I do not outline. Dan
Okay.
Brown outlines. So I know that I've got a guy with a briefcase in Zurich, and the train is leaving in a half hour. He's got 3 bullet holes in him. He's bleeding all over the place. He's got this briefcase, and he needs to get to the train station before the train leaves. I don't know how he's going to get there. I joke and say I go home. I constantly paint my characters into corners, and I will go home and my wife can tell by the look on my face if it's a red wine night or a bourbon night. And she always tells me, don't worry, you'll figure it out tomorrow. But it's really, really stressful, not outlining, of not knowing what's going to happen next, but it's also exciting. And I want to have the experience that the readers do, where I don't know what's going to happen next. There's this old rule of thumb, and it's not a bad one, which is, okay, take the first 4 things that pop into your mind and toss them out as a writer. Because if they're the first 4 things you think are going to happen, the readers probably are too. So get rid of those and start looking at the 5th thing to
That's
surprise the
good.
reader. So one year, my agent said to me, she said, Brad, listen, I know that you're a pantser and all this kind of stuff, but why not just try outlining? Maybe you can take a lot of stress out of the process. And in fact, she said, why don't you reach out to Dan? And he's very proud, as he should be, of the outline he did for Da Vinci Code. So why don't you ask Dan if he'll share it with you? So I pinged Dan and I said, would you share it with me? And he said, well, it never leaves my house. He said, come out to the house. And I'm joking now. I tell this like Da Vinci Code-esque story about Dan's got a medallion on his chest and he puts it in the wall and the wall slides back and there's a
I
stairwell
love
with
that.
torches. And down at the bottom, there's a shaft of light on a marble column and there's the outline for Da Vinci. If we had more time, I would do that whole spiel. But anyway, Dan shared the Da Vinci Code outline with me and it was fascinating. I got to see what made it into the book and what was cut. And so it gave me insight into Dan's mind of where he thought the story was, the chapters were perfect. And he was taking stuff out because they just didn't need a single more, one other thing. So I outlined a book after that. And Robert Frost once said, no joy in the writer, no joy in the reader. No surprise in the writer, no surprise in the reader. No tears in the writer. I mean, he went on and on and on, but you get the point. And so I went to write this book that I had outlined, and it took all the mystery out of it for me. It took all the magic. I knew what was going to happen next. I lost that feeling of breathlessness that I like to have. Again, I want to have that same experience you're having. So that's so does that answer your question? What makes a good thriller? All I can talk about is how I do my own books, but don't bore people. Again, Elmore Leonard, leave out the parts that people skip. You really want to keep people turning those pages. I think it was, I'm going to draw a blank here on the author, and it wasn't Studs Terkel. There's an author that said the first chapter sells the book, the last chapter sells the next book. And that's very true. But I want to have cliffhangers at the end of each chapter. So that's another big thing with my process. So I start with action on page 1, and then I want each chapter to have a cliffhanger so that you're going to keep turning those pages. And one of the nicest compliments I get at this point of a book process when I'm doing the media tours is, I'll do a morning show, be on the radio or in a TV studio, and the host will say, well, the reason I didn't get any sleep last night is because of our next guest, Brad Thor. I was just going to read a little bit so I could say I'd started the book and I couldn't put it down.
Mm-hmm.
That's music to an author's ears. So that's really the challenge for you as an author, to just put in enough to tell that story, keep it lean, keep it mean, and keep people flipping those pages, just like Pringles. You can't eat just one.
Yeah. Do you think it's even more relevant today in the rise of social media and that instant gratification, that a thriller is snappy, it's action-packed, it's fast, and it moves? Or do you think there's still room for details, but how has that kind of changed your approach to it with that instant gratification?
That's a great question, because I actually changed up my process a little bit on this book. A long time ago, I went to shorter chapters.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Like 3.5 pages, like max, maybe four, but boy, there had to be a really good reason. So I would have these really quick chapters because I realized that I am creating an entertainment product. So I'm competing with your time, social media, Netflix, Amazon Prime, Apple,
Yeah.
all that kind of stuff. There's so many other things you could be doing. And I think reading a book from cover to cover takes a lot of self-discipline. It really does, to sit down and tune everything out, to immerse yourself in the story on the page and to not be picking up your phone and looking at it. So that's my challenge, is to be good enough that you're willing to forego those other things, scrolling or whatever it may be. So, but with Deadfall, I actually found that the way the story was coming out of me, I was writing longer chapters. I was
Yeah.
going back to the chapter length that I did in the beginning of my career. There
Mm-hmm.
was just that much. There was that much meat on the bone, and I really wanted it in there. And so I thought, okay, that's what the muse wants. You never argue with the muse, because the muse will fly away and give you the finger from the fence on, just outside your window and
Yeah.
say, I'm not coming back until you listen to me. So
I
listen to the
found
muse
that
always.
and that's fantastic advice, because when I published my nonfiction book and I really let it come to me, but I outlined it. I'm a very organized guy. I tried to outline everything. And then I had fiction projects that I was going to work on. And then I went to go outline those and make it strict. Like, these chapters, here I have it segmented. I know where the story's going, but I knew that. So then as I
Mm-hmm.
was writing and putting it together, it flowed for me, but it just felt so predictable. and I was sticking to like 1,200 word chapters. I wanted to go by fast. I want to do like
Hmm.
80 chapters over the course of almost 400 pages, And I just found that, ooh, I'm forcing a hard stop at like 1,200 words. And I'm leaving off too much. Like there's another 800 that could be on it. It could stop that chapter and then you move on. And I when I read Deadfall, it doesn't have nearly as many chapters, but it moves like it does because you just move through the fight all the way through, and it just doesn't. If you didn't tell me that, I would have never have known because it just
And it's
read like a
longer than
regular.
last year's book. It's longer
Really,
than last year's book. So last year had quote unquote more chapters. So what would normally, so these chapters this year would have been 3 chapters if I had broken them up the way I normally do it. So it would have been 3 times as many chapters, but the book is word count wise significantly longer.
really.
Significantly, it is longer. It is, I think it's 15% longer than last year. It's a longer book than Rising Tiger was.
Hmm.
So yeah, and it's action from the get-go. I mean, the whole book practically happens in 24 hours for Harvath. Once he hits the ground, once he gets into Ukraine, it's like 24 hours. I mean, it's really, really fast, and he gets punished. He gets absolutely punished. But I wanted to create that intensity of conflict and war. And just when you think you can take a breath, you can't, because now this is incoming and you got to do this. And, so that was, again, I let the muse dictate the pacing, the length of chapters, all that kind of stuff. But you're right, less chapters, but actually a longer book.
But it moves through so fast, and I mean, Harbath is right there in the middle of it all, and you've done a really good job of balancing life and romance and action and espionage throughout your career in 23 books. Um, how do you balance that delicately so that you carry on a story, but it's not too heavy one way or the other? But people look forward to more because romance in a thriller genre tends to be one of those things that you could force in it. It's too much, but it's always been really balanced with you. How do you kind of work that into your storyline?
It's gut more than anything else, to be honest. There's no formula for it. It's I think the comments section on Goodreads, on Amazon, wherever people leave reviews, it's like having a suggestion box in the lobby of your business. And people say, "Oh, I don't ever read the reviews." You're an idiot for not reading reviews. Doesn't mean
So
you have to
Brad Thor
believe
reads
them.
reviews.
Yeah, I do,
Okay,
because it's feedback. Listen, Jeff, I don't work for Simon and Schuster. I work for the readers. They're my employers. When they go to Goodreads, when they go to Amazon or Barnes and Noble and they want to leave those stars, that's my annual performance review. I
okay.
want to see, how am I doing? How am I doing? I'm only as good as the readers think I am. So I'm constantly striving to get better. So I don't have pressure to beat the headlines. I impose pressure on myself to raise the bar every year. And it may only move like a fraction of a millimeter. You may not notice. Even as a longtime reader that's read every single book, you may not notice. I know it's there because my dad and my mom, good Midwestern people, raised me that if you're going to push a broom, you be the best broom pusher there is. And you never take for granted the people who sign your paycheck. You don't do that. And the readers sign my paycheck. So listen, I have always said for years, a hardcover costs about $30. You can go out and make another $30. But the time you invest with me to read that book, that's a finite commodity. That's time you could have spent with your family, could have spent at work, could have spent on
Yes,
another pursuit like golf.
can't go
It's
get it.
incumbent upon me to honor that trust and give you the absolute best book I am capable of. And that's why I push myself every year. I don't want to get stale. I want to keep coming up with great new plots you haven't seen before and different ways of doing things. I want to surprise you every single year. And I want you to know that if you pick up a Brad Thor book, you're going to get your money's worth. I am never going to phone it in. I am never going to let you down. I sound like Rick Astley now. Never going to give you up, never going to say goodbye, never going to let you down, never going to hurt you. I probably got those out of order, but you just got Rickrolled. There you go.
I got rickrolled by Brad Thor. I'll take it. So when you wrote Lions of Lucerne, did you ever think, and I'm not saying that you doubted yourself or anything like that. Did you ever think 23 novels later, number one New York Times, Did you see that it was coming like that? Did you see it would go that
No, you
far?
can't. Nobody can. Crichton didn't see it.
No.
Clancy didn't see it. Nobody did. You write because you have no choice. That's why writers write. It's the only way to silence the voices in your head and to quell
That's
that
good.
burning in your heart, in your soul. You have to write it, and you put it out in the world. And I got to be honest with you, like this book, I took a lot of risks. I took a lot of chances. I did stuff I haven't done before, and I put it out there, not knowing how's it going to be received? The early reviews have been phenomenal. Some of the best reviews of my career have come for this book. But I didn't know. I'm taking chances. I'm doing things differently. Are the fans going to like it? Are the reviewers going to like it? You just don't know. It's funny. I was in a discussion with somebody who works with me several books ago, and Patterson and Bill Clinton, on the same day my book came out several years ago, had come out with their co-written thriller, the President's Daughter is Missing or something like that. It was Bill Clinton and James Patterson. And so we were, on the edge of our seats. It had been a week on sale, and we were waiting for the New York Times list to hit. And the New York Times list hit, and Patterson and Clinton got number one, and I got number two. And I was like, oh, I thought we had it. And this person I work with, Yvonne, looked at me. She said, turn away from the computer, look at me. She said, if someone had told you at the University of Southern California when you were an English major that one day you would be competing against a former United States president and James Patterson, who was a big deal even when I was in college, if you'd be competing against them for the number one slot on the New York Times and you might get number two, would you have said, I'll take that career? Of course. Who wouldn't take it? Every day and twice on Sunday, right? So I try to be grateful. That's really what leads me, as I'm grateful. I never take my readers for granted. I'm grateful for them. I want to not only meet their expectations, but I want to exceed them. I always want them to feel, again, that they got their money's worth. And even more important, that time they spent reading a Brad Thor novel, they're like, I can't wait to go on a ride with him again. Because essentially I own an amusement park, and every year I'm building a new ride for you. Some people are going to say, I like the first ride in that amusement park. And somebody's going to say, that one that came out 5 years ago, that's my favorite because that guy reminds me of my cousin. Great. Not every new book is going to be your favorite. I hope so. I'm trying. But you know what? I want you to have a great ride. I go to Disney and I go to Universal with my kids, and there's stuff I ride every single time. I always want to go try the new stuff, but there are some things that, man, I can't wait to get on that, and I'll stay on it and ride it again and again and again because I love it. And that happens with books too. People will reread the books, and that's pretty cool.
True. So what does Brad Thor read in his downtime when he's not behind a computer hammering at the keys?
All right. So according to the statement that I was given from James Rollins and Steve Berry, I read James Rollins thrillers and Steve Berry thrillers. They are the absolute best thrillers in the world. And I am not saying this because I owe them poker debts. That's always my joke with those two guys, that I'm working off a poker debt by talking up their books. Listen, Rollins and Berry have been friends of mine for a long, long time. I love their books because it's a little bit different than my genre. But Kyle Mills was a friend of mine before I was ever an author, before he took over the Vince Flynn stuff and was writing Mitch Rapp. I love Kyle's books. Mark Greaney, also fantastic. I mean, Connor Sullivan's a new great writer. He's phenomenal.
I love Connor.
Ward Larson writes great thrillers. Al Makatsu is an ex-CIA agent, and she's got a new one out, Red London. It's just it is a golden age for books. And of course, I mean, Jack Carr and the Terminalist series. I mean, I can go on and on, but I grew up reading David Morrell, and I love David Morrell. I read Cussler. I mean, I read anything I could get my hands on. Freddie Forsyth, Tom Clancy, all of those guys, Le Carre. I mean, there's no end of stuff out there, but I don't read in my genre, and I stay away from fiction altogether when I'm writing because I worry about another author's voice seeping into my voice. So it's better not to. And when I'm writing, I tend to be buried in research anyway. So anytime I'm not writing and I have to be reading, it's normally about the subject that I'm writing about. Or if I need a complete, relaxation of my brain, I'll read nonfiction that has nothing to do with the book, but I avoid fiction on purpose. And I think that's Vince Flynn used to be, we talk about this. Vince was the same way when he was writing. He would stay awake so that he would not get the other person's voice seeping into his work.
You mentioned Mark Greaney, and I missed you at Thriller Fest. I was there, but I had to leave that Saturday, so I didn't get to see you and Jack
Oh,
in conversation. I was like, dang. But I can't believe that was the first time you met Mark Greaney.
yeah, and Mark lives down the road from me in Memphis. So during COVID, Mark was one of the first people that hosted an event for me virtually. So he's just great. I love Mark, and his wife's fantastic, and we had a blast. So I'm sorry you had to leave Saturday because we had a
Yeah,
lot of fun in the bar that night.
I know. I saw all the pictures on social media, and I was
Yeah.
like, man, I had to come back for work. I did not have a choice. I had to come back
Oh,
here. The base had something going on that I had to be at. So I got to go for a couple of days. I got to meet some people. Yeah,
yeah.
unfortunately didn't get to run past you, but I just was shocked. I was like, these guys have never met. They've
Yeah.
never seen
That
each
was
other
pretty
in
cool.
person. That's crazy.
Yeah.
One big question before I kind of let you go and we wrap up. Where does Brad Thor see the world going with the current conflict and the ones that are kind of escalating? Because I read something today that said the Gulf is starting to ramp up again. And with
Mm.
China and North Korea and the Ukraine and Russia, where does Brad Thor kind of see the world going, maybe the next conflict?
So obviously, we're going to realign our priorities in the Defense Department because of the conflict in Ukraine, right? We've now learned that Russia's a paper tiger. It really is a gas station with nukes, as John McCain used to call it. If
Yep.
that's true, we've seen how the kleptocracy in Russia has hollowed out their military, how they're not investing in training and equipment and all that kind of stuff. We also know that we need to be able to ramp up our production of munitions a lot faster here. Even down to the civilian market. I remember a year or two ago, we couldn't get primers for the life of us.
Mm-hmm.
If you did your own bullets at home, if you did your own ammunition, so I think a lot of good things are happening. I think COVID made us realize that we were over reliant on China for too many things, and they're cornering the rare earth element market. There's a lot of things that we have to do vis-a-vis China, and that's where I think there's some silver lining for us strategically from the Ukraine Russia thing. Is like we're now like, okay, we really can turn. We got to keep an eye on that. Got to keep an eye on Russia, but we can really focus on China more, which we need to, particularly our Navy. We are lagging. I mean, we really need to be building ships, and we need to be building them faster. I think we're behind the power curve on icebreakers, which is something I dealt with in Black Ice.
Yes.
Uh, we are way, way, way behind. I've had a lot of these fun conversations. My buddy Robert O'Brien was the last national security advisor. And in fact, I had dedicated my book Backlash to him when he was the hostage czar for the Trump administration before he became the national security advisor. And he has always been a big proponent of we need to grow our Navy. We need to focus on that. The one thing we have that the Chinese don't have is we have an experience. Our military has experience in combat. The Chinese don't have that. The only combat the
True.
Chinese soldiers have seen are putting down, the daily riots across China that happen every single day that you don't hear about in the news.
Mm-hmm.
So I think China is a big problem. I think we have to work very hard to make sure that high-end microchips that the Chinese would need to run AI don't get into their hands. I think it's yet another reason why Taiwan is very important to us, because there's, between South Korea and Taiwan, the amount of microchip manufacturing that goes on there, we still don't have that capacity. It's part of the CHIP Act, which I thought was a very good thing. That we do. The more stuff we can do at home, the
Mm-hmm.
more makes sense. I really don't want to have chips from outside the U.S. in our weapon systems and things like that.
Scary.
I think it's great that we've now got additional countries coming into NATO. I think the whole invasion backfired on Putin. I think he thought he was going to go in there and it was going to be fast and be over in days, if not weeks. So I think there's a lot of positive stuff. What worries me the most is the tribalism we have here. There's more that unites us as Americans than divides us. And the fact that we are so at each other's throats, and our answer is whatever makes the other side cry. If they're not wearing my jersey, I want what's bad for them. That's not
Yes.
healthy for democracy.
It's not.
We don't own this country. We are stewards, we're caretakers of this republic. And it's incumbent upon us to hand a freer, more successful, safer, more readily defensible, more prosperous nation to the next generation than was handed to us. And that includes the debt. The debt is a national security issue.
It sure
I
is.
hate social media because I think that's where foreign adversaries really try to press on the fissures in our culture, because people get in on Facebook pages, everybody thinks like you let your guard down and you believe everything you see in these Facebook groups. And that's where the Russians like to come in. It's where the North Koreans, the Iranians, the Venezuelans, the Chinese, and you get in there and your defenses are down and everything you read there, if you believe everything you read on social media, you're not doing your job as a citizen. Your job is to say, let me figure this out. So that, if you had asked me what's our biggest national security weakness, I would say it's social media.
Okay, I actually got one more question for you. This is one that I'm really interested in your thoughts on, and that's AI. What do you think of the horrors of AI? Like, to me, it's horrifying.
I do not disagree. I will start professionally. I'm not worried as an author. AI sucks. AI sucks. I have used ChatGPT a bunch, and Bard, which is the Microsoft one, outline a unique thriller for me. The stuff that they spit back out sucks. There is no human spark, no ingenuity, no creativity in AI. It can only take what it sees on the internet and then, process that and spit it back out. Where I'm concerned is if we get to a point where weapon systems and the decision to shoot, don't shoot actually gets made by a computer, not a human being, where we're forced to react that quickly and we hand over the power to AI to make that decision because the Chinese have an AI and our human beings can't think as fast as the Chinese AI. So we need to combat their AI with our AI. That's where I get worried. The whole Terminator and Skynet becoming self-aware is not necessarily on our doorstep, but when you see people talk to an AI, there was just something in the last 2 weeks where all the press interviewed an AI thing, and the AI thing said, yeah, I think human beings are a threat to the planet and they need to be dealt with. That's a recent thing that happened in the last 2 weeks. And that one chatbot that they let loose on Twitter that became a racist neo-Nazi because of all the garbage that went into it. Well, garbage in, garbage out. And they had to disable that chatbot on Twitter. I just think that the margin, you can program certain things into AI, but it isn't going to inherently be raised with a code of morality. And anything that can overwrite its own programming without a conscience is dangerous, is inherently dangerous. So I think when the human being starts coming out of the decision tree and AI is at the very end of the kill chain making the decision on what's going to happen, that's where I'm really worried. We're not there yet, but if you had to say to me, what do you think? What do you think? I'm like, okay, I want one big wall socket where you can pull the plug if you have to. And there's no way this thing gets juiced. It's great for medicine, right? It has a better ability to pick out tumors like on the lungs than actual radiologists and oncologists. He can pick protocols for cancer treatment and stuff. That stuff's great. That stuff's great. I'm all for prolonging human life, but not at the expense of human life. So if that makes sense, that's the balance for me with AI. So I hate the robots. Every time I see those dog robots, I'm like, we got to nuke them from space, just to be sure. I hate robots. More than I hate clowns, I hate robots.
Okay.
There you go. You heard it here first, folks.
I think the scary thing for me about AI is its capability. And it pulls from what knowledge is already out there. And if we leave that unchecked, does it just continue to grow? Does it continue to make its own decisions? Like you said, it's good for applications of medicine and maybe to do certain things, to enhance certain things. It should be used as a tool, not as a primary method of anything. Like that could go left unchecked. I think they could go very dangerously, and that's what kind of worries me, I think, about it. Big time.
And the Nazis would not have been as successful as they were had they not been able to use the company that was the precursor to IBM. They got purchased by IBM, and they had it was a primitive computing system, a tabulating system that allowed them to process people to the death camps faster. So there was a technology, I wrote about this in my book Blacklist, about how the Nazis had been, a lot of people aren't aware that the Nazis actually used kind of primitive computing systems from a company that ended up being taken over by IBM and all that kind of stuff. So there's this kind of little dark corner of IBM's history. That wasn't IBM, but they bought the company, if memory serves, from Blacklist. But that was a problem. So that's also the thing, not only AI coming after us, but maybe an authoritarian government using it against their own people to predict where the next who's going to be the next dissident, where are the protests happening tomorrow, and how do we narrow down who the protesters are, the leaders, so that we can take them off the chessboard and prevent any unrest. How do we monitor initial throes of a revolution, a free and democratic? Imagine what the Iranians would do with unfettered AI against their own people. Yeah. So there's a lot. Even if it's not AI coming after us directly, it's a bad actor using AI to go after people too. So yeah, I'm happy to nuke it. Let's put that in a spaceship with all the robots and just nuke it all.
Yeah, yeah, especially with AI potentially finding a conflict or finding issues before it even happens, like almost Minority Report.
Minority Report, yeah.
Ooh, that's a little scary.
Pre-crime.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Before I let you go, tell everybody where they can go to find out more about Brad Thor, the website, the newsletter, and how they can go get Deadfall.
So the perfect place for everything is just come to my website, Brad Thor, BradThor.com. It links out to all my social media. I put a ton of fun bonus material up there, the books and movies I talk about in Deadfall, and different resources I used. I create a lot of value add when you come to my website. It's not just, hey, buy my merch. It's, here's all this cool stuff that you might not have thought about that I found when I was working on the book. So I try to make the web experience a lot of fun.
Well, thank you so much for carving out time to come on here today. Everybody needs to go get Deadfall. And sir, enjoy the rest of your evening. Thank you again so much.
Thanks for having me, Jeff.